Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation entitled India and What Its Democracy Means to the United States and to the World. This is our first virtual presentation in a while, and it's fantastic that the program committee is attempting to fill slots for virtual programs. They were very easy to come by at the beginning of COVID. I think presenters sort of got oversaturated with virtual presentations as time went on, but it is certainly our goal as a board to continue offering our members 2 presentations every month, an in-person luncheon presentation and a virtual presentation. And many thanks to our program committee, Kim Johnson, our chair, and Dave Carroll and Lynn Brown, who have been very proactive in attempting to identify not only in-person presenters for us, but virtual presenters as well. So our presenter today is Dr. Daniel Markey, who is a senior advisor on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. He is also a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Foreign Policy Institute. From 2015 to 2021, Dr. Markey was a senior research professor in international relations at Johns Hopkins, where he launched and led the Master of Arts in Global Policy degree program and taught courses in international politics and policy. From 2007 to 2015, Dr. Markey was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2003 to 2007, Dr. Markey was a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. His work there focused on US strategy in South Asia, especially Pakistan and India. Prior to government service, he taught in the Department of Politics at Princeton and served as executive director of Princeton's research program in international security. Dr. Markey has 2 decades of academic, think tank, and government experience focused on international relations and US policy in Asia, with a particular focus on South Asia and China's evolving role in the region. Dr. Markey earned his bachelor's in international relations from Johns Hopkins and his doctorate in politics from Princeton. Dr. Markey is published. He is the author of China's Western Horizon, Beijing, and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia. That book assesses the evolving political, economic, and security links between China and its Western neighbors, including Pakistan, India, Kazakhstan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. He is also the author of No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad, as well as numerous reports, articles, book chapters, and opinion pieces. It is with great pleasure that I formally announce hand over the presentation this morning to Dr. Markey. Doctor, it's a thrill to have you with us, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Q&A will follow, so Mike is working on getting the chat up and running, but as soon as you think of a question for Dr. Markey, please insert it in the chat. I will see it and we'll handle it accordingly. So with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Markey. Welcome.
Thank you, David. And thanks for the nice introduction. Much appreciated. I'm very happy to be able to join you and appreciate the opportunity to do so virtually, which of course, since I'm based in Washington, D.C., makes everything a bit easier for me. I look forward to our opportunity both for me to share some views, but also to exchange in a Q&A afterwards. I did want to just preface my remarks by observing that I'm coming to you today from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Well, I'm sitting at home right now, but I work at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with USIP, I wanted to explain that the U.S. Institute of Peace was established by Congress, was signed into law by President Reagan in 1984 as a national, nonpartisan public institution dedicated to helping prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. It's a remarkable place. Our offices are located in Washington, D.C., directly across the street from the State Department. We host a wide range of events and programming. We also maintain an excellent website where a variety of our publications are available, all free. If it wasn't clear by our founding, our jobs, our positions are all paid for by you, the American taxpayer, through directly from Congress. We are not strictly a part of the administration or any administration, but we definitely work to further and advance American aims, particularly related to peace and security. So if you're interested in USIP, this will be the end of my plug, you can check out any of our events, which a number of which are available online. And you can follow us on social media, on Twitter, at USIP, or on Instagram at USIP or at USI Peace. So that's my plug. Let me dive right into the topic that brings us here today. That is India's democracy and India and the implications of India's democracy for the world and especially for the United States. And I'll start by observing that today we're meeting at a really kind of interesting moment in history in terms of India's relations with other countries. And in particular, if you haven't been following the news, a story that might have escaped your attention, but we're right now witnessing what I think can be characterized as a significant diplomatic dispute that has emerged kind of out of nowhere between India and our neighbor to the north, Canada. Both of these are important countries for the United States. And of course, Canada being maybe our closest of closest allies, both in terms of geographic proximity and in terms of the way that we work together with them routinely. And India, an important rising power in Asia, an enormous country in the world, a democracy, a fellow democracy, and a country that at least since the time of President Clinton, the United States has worked to cultivate better and closer ties with. And just the other day, we saw this kind of remarkable episode where Canada's Prime Minister got up in front of the Canadian Parliament and basically accused the Indian government of perpetrating the assassination of a Canadian national on Canadian soil. And since then, India has responded, has rejected that allegation. And the two have then, in sort of a tit-for-tat fashion, have kicked each other's top spies out of each other's countries. The dispute has now escalated to both sides releasing kind of competing travel warning and advisories to their own citizens about travel to the other's countries. And this is a very strange thing, if you haven't figured that out so far. And, I think it relates pretty directly to some of the other topics that I want to discuss here today. So let me just, with that opener, kind of return to that story at the end of my comments. So let's talk a little bit about what India's democracy is and what India's democracy isn't. So India's democracy is the world's largest. It's a parliamentary democracy. It's got a number of different parties, both national and regional. It has routine and regular elections, both at the national and the state level. It follows a first past the post system. That is, whoever wins the most votes within a particular constituency wins. It has a federal system, which is somewhat familiar to that of the United States, where you've got strong Indian states with their own governments, as well as a strong national government with capital based in New Delhi. And it has a constitutionally backed order. So it has an actual constitution, unlike some democracies, which also makes it somewhat familiar to us. Now, every democracy is different in lots of ways. But I think many of the constitutional and institutional features of the Indian system would be pretty familiar to many Americans. So that's what it is. What India's democracy is not. India's democracy is not, strictly speaking, liberal. Now, let me be clear what I mean by that. India is a diverse society. Its political institutions reflect that diversity of language, of religion, ethnicity even, and background. Um, but the Lockean liberal tradition that's very familiar here in the United States, that's sort of central to American political culture. So when I say liberal, I'm not talking about conservative versus liberal. I'm talking about Lockean liberalism, which basically means the emphasis on individual rights, including and especially property rights, free markets, and freedom from the intrusion of the state into our lives as much as is possible. That tradition is much less prevalent or dominant in India. The well springs of India's democracies and democracy in its own political culture are different from America's, and that's not surprising. Many democracies have different political, historical, cultural well springs. So that makes India a democracy like many others, but it means it's somewhat different in the way that it thinks about the world, and it thinks about the nature of the relationship between the state and the individual and the state and communities within India. So just because it's a democracy doesn't mean that it necessarily sees the world the same way. And this is true within Indian society. And I think it's also true in terms of how Indians see India's relationship with the rest of the world. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise to us, but I point it out because I think that many Americans, including Americans who perhaps ought to know better, don't necessarily appreciate some of those differences. And we see really important examples from our own history, even of American presidents who I think have misunderstood the nature of India's democracy and what that means for India's worldview. And so I recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs magazine where I identified some sort of seminal or important instances where US presidents have thought that have looked over to India and assumed that Indian leaders would kind of see the world the same way as Americans do, or at least as they did, in part because India is a democracy. So a really interesting example from actually just before India achieved its own independence was an exchange between then President FDR, Roosevelt, and India's nationalist and independence-oriented leader, Gandhi. And FDR actually writes Gandhi and says, look, I understand the nature of your concerns about achieving independence and freedom from British colonial rule, but we're facing a world war here right now. And so I think it would be very helpful if India could focus, and if you could focus, on fighting the near enemy, that is Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and maybe putting aside your independence concerns for the time being and circle back to them after the war, effectively. And of course, Gandhi, also a Democrat, reflecting a very different perspective on the world, and not a wrong one, was not at all convinced by FDR's logic. Similarly, during the Cold War, Eisenhower and Kennedy and other American presidents, many of them assumed that India, also, again, still a democracy, would see the value of aligning itself with the United States and its partners and against the Soviet Union, clearly not a democracy. And yet, throughout much of the Cold War, India actually had a softer spot for its relations with Moscow than with Washington, and was not convinced by American arguments that, in fact, India's interests aligned more appropriately with the West, with the United States. And so, this isn't, I'm not trying to make a right-wrong value judgment about who's right and who's wrong in the United States or India, but only to say that our shared democracy hasn't historically led to an obvious and shared alignment on a lot of important global issues. I would also say, in terms coming back to the broader points of what India is not, India's democracy is not immune to erosion or backsliding. No democracy is immune to this. All democracies have the potential to be impermanent, have the potential to slide into something else, into more illiberal and autocratic realities, political realities. And no democracy, of course, as I think we know, is perfect. And right now, global trends that are leading to more populism, more majoritarian rule, and strengthening autocracies or non-democracies in many parts of the world, those kinds of trends are also affecting Indian politics. So the problems of misinformation and disinformation, the challenges associated with understanding fact from fiction, of working within a media environment where social media is very prominent, and so on and so forth, all of these are very much felt in India as they are felt elsewhere. Okay, so India is a democracy, and yet India is also perhaps not liberal, at least not in the American sense, and not immune to backsliding. And that last point is critical as I shift to a different set of issues, which is that right now, and over, I would say, the past decade or so, there's been a particular and specific set of concerns raised about Indian democratic erosion, about the ways in which India's democracy seems to be being hollowed out or weakened by its current government, particularly, but by these other factors as well. And its current government, as I imagine most of you understand, run by the BJP party and led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And there have been a number of major studies undertaken outside of India where independent publications have reached the conclusion that they're seeing worrisome signs of erosion in India's democracy. So, I won't go into too much detail here, but among them, we have a group called VDEM. There's also Freedom House, The Economist. They've all done these studies independently. And they tend, on the whole, to cite three types of problems emerging in India's democratic order, and to see a deterioration, particularly in terms of the government's influence or interference in free press and media. So they're seeing problems of censorship, of harassment of journalists, of pressure on independent publishers. And at least according to Freedom House, and I'll quote, they say, attacks on press freedom have escalated dramatically under the Modi government, and reporting has become significantly less ambitious in recent years. So attacks on free media. A second point is a concern about the repression or undermining of civil society groups, of non-governmental organizations of one kind or another. And here the concern is that the Indian government, again, over the past decade or so, has used a variety of laws and regulations that have been, many of them already on the books, but has used them in much more aggressive ways to target organizations that are critical of the government's policies. So from the years 2014 to 2018, for instance, using laws on the books, the Indian government basically withdrew operating licenses from something like 20,000 non-governmental organizations in India, basically canceled their ability to operate inside of India. And the group Scholars at Risk, which is an American organization, in 2020 reported, and again, I'll quote, that there was an apparent surge in incidents alongside heightened nationalistic rhetoric by Prime Minister Modi that underscore fears that the space for ideas and dialogue in India is being constricted and dissent punished. Okay, so that's the second set of concerns. And a third set of concerns is that minority rights are not being adequately protected, and especially the rights of India's Muslim community, which is not small. It's something on the order of about 200 million people out of India's total population of roughly 1.4 billion. Here I'll cite a 2021 report from the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. They say that India's government has been engaging in and tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious freedom violations. And it's done so through the use, again, of a number of laws, some of them already on the books, others proposed, that in total have the consequence of persecuting minority populations, and again, especially Muslim population in India, and threatening them with becoming not citizens or even statelessness for many residents inside of India. Now, to be clear, despite all of these concerns, India is still a democracy. It's gearing up for elections sometime this spring. State elections are routine, and they are often hotly contested and not always won by India's ruling party. And India's judiciary, another force within the Indian political system, is still an important source of protection for various rights, individual rights, and it doesn't always side with the ruling government. So it's not been completely captured by the BJP, even though here too, there are a number of experts who have concerns about politicization of the Indian judiciary. Okay, so that's point one. We're seeing some apparent erosion in India's democracy. Point two, I made the case that India wasn't so much of a liberal democracy, at least in the Lockean liberal tradition, ever. But there are reasons to be concerned that there is rising illiberalism in India now, again, under the Modi government. So the concerns here really relate to the fact that the Indian government and Prime Minister Modi, they hail, or his party is tightly connected to, and many of them are members of, Hindu nationalist organizations. And by their own characterization, India should be perceived as a Hindu nation, as a homeland for Hindus. And this is in contrast to, say, a more plural or secular vision for India, in which India is perceived as not a homeland just for Hindus, but for people of all faiths, of a variety of different faiths at least, many of whom have practiced their religions in India for literally hundreds of years. Now, Hindu nationalists tend to not just see India as a homeland for Hindus, but also see the world more broadly as one of competing and contrasting civilizations. And they define national identities tend to, in communal and civilizational terms. So there's the West, the sort of Abrahamic or Christian West. There's the ancient civilization of Iran or Persia, an ancient civilization in China, and so on. And India is itself the inheritor of an ancient civilization and should be reflective of that. And of course, all of this is interesting, but it's actually important when you think of it as just how different it is from, say, a perspective of the world that sees the world as many Americans have, and certainly as the Biden administration now tends to present it, as one of competition between liberal democratic states like the United States or states in Western Europe or Japan or South Korea, and illiberal and undemocratic states, say, like Russia or China. So this is a very different kind of worldview. And a part of what India's leaders, Hindu nationalist leaders, are attempting to do is to inculcate this ideology of Hindu nationalism in India, to make it more widely understood and practiced and believed among Indians themselves through changes in education policy, extension of various civic organizations devoted to this cause, and championing parts of Indian culture and history that really relate directly to Hinduism as compared to other religions. So that's what we see in terms of, I think, rising illiberalism in India. Now, what are the implications of this? Now, the implications for India are obviously felt mostly within India itself. I mean, this is a huge country, and most of the focus on what all of this means has focused on what it means for, say, minorities within India, or journalists, or civil society organizations, and so on. And all of that is very important because, you know, clearly with 1.4 billion people, about 1 in every 6 humans on Earth are living in India. That means that whatever happens there is going to be important in and of itself. But I think the area where I would tend to focus and where my work focuses on is, what does this mean for the rest of the world? And this has been, I think, far less well understood. And that's partially because many scholars of international relations tend to talk about the world in what is often described as realist terms. That is, they think that how states operate inside the states are a lot less important than, say, the relative power that they bring to their relations to other states. So we sometimes describe this as realpolitik or structural realism, where basically interests of states are defined not by what they think or what they do at home, but by relative power and power politics in their relations with other states. So that's part of why We don't tend to ask a lot of these kinds of questions. Another part of this is that most of the people who know most about what's happening inside of India are somewhat less concerned about foreign policy or Indian foreign policy. And so it's simply a matter of who does what professionally. So I'm trying to bridge this gap. It's been a particular area of interest for me, not just in India, but in other countries as well, the ways in which domestic or internal developments affect the way that they see and perceive and act internationally. And here I would sketch out 4 basic pathways by which what happens inside of a country, and in this case, inside of India, has the potential to affect the way that it works internationally. So these pathways begin with the question of aims. The first pathway is how India acts at home is likely to affect what it wants to do abroad. We believe, or many scholars tend to anticipate, that liberal democracies perceive the world differently from illiberal autocracies or non-liberal states. There's a common and widely understood and talked about observation that there's a peace between liberal democracies. Basically, we look out into history and we see that there really hasn't been a war between liberal democracies. And that relates ultimately to an expectation that liberal democracies, in terms of their aims and the way that they see the world, anticipate that when they're dealing with other liberal democracies, they can resolve their problems peacefully without war. We also expect that liberal democracies are going to be somewhat more invested in features of the international order, things like international institutions and rule of law and so on, that reflect their underlying attachment to these values. And they'll expect that those kinds of systems, even if they don't always adhere to them, and they certainly don't, are probably better than a world without them. And so by all of this logic, we can come to the very basic observation that a less liberal, less democratic India, one will be less committed to advancing or championing a liberal world order, and probably less likely to easily be assumed to work out its problems with other liberal democracies without resorting to force or violence. Okay, so that's about aims. The second point is about policy process. How does a liberal democracy figure out what it's going to do and then actually do it in terms of its foreign policy? And here, a major distinction between democracies and non-democracies is supposed to be that democracies are more transparent and at least more or somewhat more accountable to their people, because ultimately their leaders are voted in and out by their citizens. And because of that transparency and accountability, when they make decisions about their foreign policies and what they're going to do in the world, they're probably going to be cognizant of and try to explain what they're doing to their publics. That's going to make them more transparent to the rest of the world as well, and should also make them probably more trustworthy in terms of their dealings, particularly with their allies and partners. So because they have to explain what they're doing to their own publics and then justify it and then survive votes of their publics to vote them in or out of office, they're going to make marginally better and more trustworthy partners than, say, an autocrat who is not ultimately responsible to his own people, and who can perhaps be more personalistic in his decisions and maybe bluff or lie on the international stage more effectively without paying an immediate price from elections in his own country. Okay, a third way in which democracy can matter is the actual creation of power within a state. What makes democracies potentially more capable on the world stage than non-democracies is their ability to generate hard power, and that is to make them better at building economies at home. Now, we used to think that, maybe simplistically, that democracies were just better at making money and producing wealth internally than non-democracies. I think the experience, certainly, of China's rise has raised some pretty important questions about the logic of that. But even so, we still believe that a state like India that is, say, becoming less inclusive in its democracy and perhaps repressing minorities, and the broader public in ways that it didn't used to, will probably be less capable of building its own power that it could then use internationally. And so here, the reasons for this is, if you rule out or alienate parts of your population because they feel less a part of your society, say the Muslim minority in India, then you're ruling out or excluding potential workforce, and you're also excluding diversity, which should be innovative and increase the quality or the capacity of your economy. You're probably also going to be spending a lot of time and attention and perhaps money and resources on securing your own internal state against pressures. You're having to repress your own people rather than using those resources internationally. And so, if you have finite resources, you'd rather be spending them internationally than at home. So power creation is probably going to suffer if India is less democratic. And then last, or fourth, other states are going to perceive you differently if you're more or less democratic. Certainly, India has been perceived by the United States and other partners in Europe and elsewhere as a likely and attractive partner, in part because we see it as a fellow democracy. The less that's the case, the less attractive India may be. And it's not just the United States who will have problems with that, but there'll be other countries in the world who will look to India, say an increasingly Hindu nationalist India, and be nervous about what that means. Certainly in the Muslim world outside of India, there will be increasing problems and concerns raised should India behave in ways that they would perceive as being less friendly to their Muslims within India. So there's a problem here as well in terms of perceptions of the rest of the world about India will change. And so its internal politics matter there as well. Okay, let me wrap up with what all this means for the United States. There are a lot of reasons still for us to see India as a very important country. I've mentioned it as a partner, a strategic partner, particularly in the context of the rise of China. So India may be a vital partner in that context. But I would say we still, for all of the reasons that I've laid out, we can't afford to overlook our potential differences, our real and potential differences with India, and particularly to understand how India may be evolving under the leadership of Narendra Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party. If India continues along this path, it will be less aligned with US aims. It will probably be less capable as a partner overall in terms of its hard power, and will be a less trustworthy partner than we would like it to be, or than we might have hoped that it would be under different circumstances. So it's an important thing for the United States to keep a close eye, I think, on all of these developments inside of India. It's also important that we speak truthfully and publicly about these concerns, we as Americans, but also our leaders in government, as well as in Congress. And it's also important that we consider what these changes and trends should lead us to, say, limit in terms of our cooperation going forward. We have all lived, or many of us who are old enough have lived through the experience of cultivating closer ties with China over decades, with the hope and expectation that by engaging China, working with them economically, having Chinese students here in the United States, and so on and so forth, we would eventually find that cooperation would characterize our relationship, and perhaps in the fullness of time, that China would even become a better and more trustworthy partner because of that engagement. And we've been disappointed by that. We've had to come to realize that there are limitations to what engagement can mean for a society and a government in particular that's very different from our own. India is no China, and I don't mean to suggest that, but I think we should still recognize that there may be limits to the kinds of things that we'd like to do with India now, because India's future is not foreordained, and its future as a strategic partner of the United States doesn't mean that we'll always see eye to eye. And all of that brings me back full circle to that drama that I laid out at the beginning between India and Canada right now. And I think what we're seeing is a sign of the ways in which India, again, a democracy, but a democracy with a different perspective on the world, and Canada, a liberal democracy and close friend of the United States, are seeing each other and seeing their dispute. And it's quite revealing that India felt, apparently, if Canada's allegations are true, that India felt that Canada was so untrustworthy and so unlikely to take action against individuals that India considers to be terrorists, that India felt justified of actually trying to assassinate them and successfully killing one of them inside of Canada. That's quite revealing. But it's also revealing that Canada apparently attempted to share its concerns about what was happening with India and was rebuffed, and then came to the conclusion that this government, this Indian government in India, was not one that they could work with very effectively, and that they had to voice their concerns publicly. And in both cases, this suggests a gap I think that ultimately relates back to many of these issues of India's democratic erosion and underlying illiberalism that's quite worrisome, because what India does with Canada will not be unique. And so I think we should watch this drama as well very closely and see how it unfolds. Obviously, the truth is not all out yet, and I don't want to prejudge which way it will go, but I think it will have broader implications for all of us. So let me leave it there, and I look forward, as I say, to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Doctor. Very, very informative presentation. Looking forward to the Q&A as well. I don't see any questions yet in the chat. I have a couple that I've come up with, but I certainly encourage our members to get your questions out there so that we can make sure Dr. Markey addresses them. Before we get to the Q&A, I just want to make a couple announcements about some upcoming programs that we have. Our next in-person presentation will be October the 11th at noon at our new venue, Alvernia University's McGlynn Conference Center. The topic will be, Will Russia Survive Until 2084? Presented by Philip Wazlewski, who is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program. And he is a 31-year career officer with the CIA before he retired. We then also have on October the 19th, our upcoming Pub Global Trivia fundraiser. That is scheduled to start at 5:30 at the Sly Fox Tap Room. Registrations are coming in slowly, so we certainly encourage those of our members who are interested in either participating on a team or serving as cheerleaders for the event to log on to our website and to get your registrations in. There are also two upcoming events with our partner colleges, starting on October the 2nd at, looks like 7:30 at Albright College. The Leo Camp Memorial Lecture Series for the month will be on the topic of, will the environment survive a renewed Middle East peace process, presented by Elan Tal. So that is October the 2nd, 7:30 in the South Lounge at the Student Union Center building at Albright. And finally, I just learned this morning that one of our other partner colleges, Penn State Berks, will be presenting on October the 10th at 6:15 in the evening, a film entitled Cairo Conspiracy. So this presentation is run through Penn State's Global Oscars program. The film itself is a 2022 Best Screenplay Award winner at the Cannes International Film Festival. This program will be held in room 5 of the Luzerne Science Building at Penn State Berks. I'm sure you can get more information about that by either reaching out to any of our board members. Certainly Randy Newnham at Penn State Berks can provide more information if needed. But if you have questions about any of these programs, please feel free to reach out and we will get you connected. So with that, let's move into the Q&A. So it's curious to me, Doctor, when you talk about the BJP, being the ruling party, as someone who was a political science major 40 years ago, studied international relations a lot, I remember a time when the Congress Party was the ruling party in India, and it seems like the Congress Party has been marginalized over the course of the last 10, 15, 20 years. And perhaps Indian democracy has lost that counterweight. Where is that counterweight today, and what does the future of the Congress Party look like in India?
Yeah, it's a great observation. You're absolutely right. The Indian Congress Party was the dominant force in Indian politics. And actually, if you wanted to look back to an earlier period where India's democracy was really suffering, the greatest threat to Indian democracy actually came from Indira Gandhi, who declared an emergency and basically put herself up as the undemocratic leader of India in the 1970s. This was partially the consequence of crises within India, but also was a reflection of just how dominant Congress was. But you're also right that what we've seen over the past, now it's been multiple decades, has been a deterioration of Congress's rule, in part because of its own missteps, in part because it just has lacked the kind of core leadership that it had under Nehru, especially a founding leader of India, in part because of corruption scandals and other mismanagement, and in part because of the rise of an effective challenger in the BJP, which we first saw come to the fore in the mid-late 90s, but not under Narendra Modi, but under his predecessors, who offered a different vision for India, partially this Hindu nationalism, which caught on with certain circles, but also a sense of urgency about growing the Indian economy and a different expectation in terms of Indian development path, less socialist, more capitalist, and encouraging a lot of that. So it offered a serious contrast to the Congress, and it was fairly successful in doing so. Congress did come back in the early 2000s. So it's not been a sort of a direct and linear path for the BJP. But now they're in a kind of a dominant place. Congress's leader right now, Rahul Gandhi, grandson of Nehru, just has not been perceived by the wider Indian public as having either the charisma or the capacity of a number of other Indian leaders. He's seen as being not terribly effective. And the party itself has failed to figure out what it really stands for, in contrast to a BJP, which has been quite effective. And on that point, one of the features of the BJP, which is really astounding, is its connection to a grassroots Hindu nationalist movement, which is active across vast swaths of India, which has mobilized not just voters, but volunteers to get out the vote and to be responsive in many ways to the demands of local public. It's not always universally responsive, but responsive to those who are supporters of them, and to demonstrate what they can do, that they can actually deliver and meet the needs of many Indians. And they've been quite effective at doing that. And so it's the convergence of an underlying kind of civil society set of organizations. The one that's often mentioned is the RSS, which is a hardline Hindu nationalist organization, which has chapters across India, as being very effective at mobilizing. And Congress and other parties in India have nothing like it. So they're having trouble matching the energy and the organizational power of the BJP, which weakens them at the national level as well as at the local level. So they can still fight and contest elections. BJP doesn't always win. But BJP is still considered to be the dominant force. To the extent that there are other serious challengers, they tend to be regional parties. And the regional parties of India tend to be able to mobilize on the basis of more particular regional concerns, so state level concerns, where the BJP at a national level has to kind of stand somewhat more consistent across the country, can't always fight on the basis of those sort of more particularistic considerations. So that's, the way I see the development. I hope that's gotten to some of your question.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you very much. So my next question, so Dr. Randy Noonan, one of our board members, just submitted a question that I was going to ask anyway. Still waiting for other questions. Those who are participating today, please ask. So Randy's question that I had as well was, so since the end of the Second World War, the international system has been operating under a Western liberal worldview that has come under challenge by Russia, by China. And I guess I'm wondering, where India fits in with this dynamic. I mean, you've explained to us that India is not necessarily liberal in the Western tradition. And you also explained that there was that unaligned movement in the 1970s where India was cozying up to an extent, with the Soviets in Moscow. Just curious where you see this dynamic playing out in the future.
Yeah, so this is at the core of sort of the strategic calculations, certainly here in many circles in Washington, because as as members of the Biden administration, particularly at the National Security Council, kind of look out and gaze into their crystal balls in the future, and look at a future of pretty obvious geopolitical competition with China, and worry that Russia and China are more and more aligning with one another. They see India as this huge potential kingmaker or counterweight or vital partner in America's sort of ability to compete. And what they most want to avoid is a situation in which India would, for whatever reason, choose to align itself more with the not West than with the West. So they're assiduously cultivating this relationship with India. And you've seen this, the Biden administration had Modi here for a state visit, in part to really play up the nature of the relationship. Biden was just in New Delhi for the G20, and there were a lot of instances where he and Modi were very, very buddy-buddy. It's possible that Biden will be back in New Delhi in January for India's Republic Day celebrations at Modi's invitation. So there's a real effort to do all of this, all with this question of, where will India be? Will it be with us or will it be against us? And the answer is usually provided by, I think, fairly articulately by India's own foreign minister, Jaishankar, who says India won't be with you or against you. India will be for itself. That is, India's principal animating purpose is to make the world safe for India to rise and not be beholden to any particular power, and not necessarily, it can be aligned with other countries as far as that serves India's purposes. But it doesn't want to take sides to advance somebody else's agenda. So, so as India looks to China, it sees an increasingly threatening power and a competitor. As it looks to Russia, it sees, actually, quite unlike the United States, it tends to see Russia as a very useful and important independent actor for as long as Russia can be an independent actor. Because as long as Russia is out there, it makes the world more complicated, creates more options. India has had as you pointed out, long historic ties to the Soviet Union. Those continue in the forms of arms purchases from Russia, high-end arms, not just little stuff, but nuclear submarines, air defense systems, the very best stuff that Russia has on offer. And India would like to continue to see Russia as a potential partner in various areas, even as it works with the United States or works with Western Europe or others. So I guess this is my way of saying, India's ideal world is a multipolar world, a world where it's safe to go its own way and not necessarily have to pick sides, say, in a bipolar contest between the United States and China. And, that's, again, very different from the way many of us here in the United States tend to see things. We see an emerging or evolving bipolar world, and we're very, very eager to get India on side. And I think that's an important distinction in terms of expectations going forward between Washington and New Delhi. Doesn't mean we can't work together, but it means that ultimately we're not exactly aiming at the same target.
And to follow up that answer, what, if any, formal security arrangements does the United States have with India?
Yeah, we actually have, historically, in historical terms, we have a lot now. We have, over the past basically 2 decades or so, worked to come up with a series of what they describe as foundational defense agreements. And they're mainly agreements that are kind of low level, but they enable cooperation between our 2 militaries and to some extent our 2 intelligence services to operate more effectively with one another. And, it's important to point out that up until the end of the Cold War, there were absolutely no such arrangements with India. And we weren't strictly at odds with the Indian military, but we certainly weren't partners with them. Now that these agreements are in place, there are things that we are doing and can do with India in terms of selective intelligence sharing. We also do military joint exercises on land and at sea, many of them every year. We do a variety of defense sales to India. So I mentioned that India buys some very high-end stuff from Russia. Well, they're increasingly buying things from us too. They've purchased large aircraft for transport of other equipment. They've purchased various surveillance planes, as well as artillery. And now they are in the process of, it appears, purchasing a number of surveillance drones, pretty high-end stuff that the United States is eager to sell. And if the Biden administration has its way, there is the likelihood that the 2 sides will go forward in a co-production arrangement for GE jet engines that would then be the kind of the at the core of future Indian fighter aircraft. And this is being proclaimed as a major step forward in the U.S.-India defense relationship, because we've never sold anything this sensitive to India before. And in fact, it may be surprising to hear, but some of this technology is some of the most sophisticated military technology that we actually have. It's very difficult to make these engines well. GE has the capacity to do it. We don't share this technology with just about anybody in the world. And it appears that we're likely to move forward with India on this. I've written elsewhere that I have qualms about that. I think that there are a lot of things we can do with India. But if in fact this technology is correctly described as crown jewels of our arsenal, then we should move forward very carefully, because it's not entirely clear to me that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we won't find ourselves in a situation where we would regret that we had transferred that high-end technology to India, because we simply don't know what political path they're likely to travel.
So I guess as a follow-up to that one too, so we have India and China who are really in close proximity to one another, both, rising regional and perhaps superpowers someday. Obviously, there's a risk of conflict there. You mentioned that obviously India is concerned about the threat that China poses long-term. How is India managing that threat right now?
Yeah, so this isn't just a hypothetical in a sense. In 2020, probably many of you of your listeners will remember, we saw a clash along the border in the high Himalayas between India and China. This is a contested border. The 2 sides simply do not agree on precisely where the line is between their 2 countries, their territories. They have competing claims, and they have, for decades, have sent patrols along this border area in areas where one side will claim it's their territory, the other claims it's their territory. And in the summer of 2020, you saw these patrols come into direct conflict with one another. And they've done this before. They've clashed a bit, but this time, unlike at any time in the past over 4 decades, push came to shove, quite literally, and you saw Indian troops being killed by the Chinese, something like 20, and at least 4 Chinese soldiers were also killed. This didn't end there. It escalated further. The 2 sides really came toe-to-toe. You literally saw situations where Indian and Chinese tanks were within eyesight of one another along some of these high altitude plateaus separating the two countries. There were some major operations undertaken in terms of bringing forces, something on the order of 50,000 troops brought by each side much closer to the border. You saw exchanges of fire, which you hadn't seen before, although apparently no one was actually shot. And that series of back and forths led to, a real diplomatic dispute, which brought New Delhi and Beijing into a situation where their leaders really didn't talk and didn't see one another for another over 2 years. So the tensions were actually quite high, higher than really at any point in decades. The situation remains unresolved, although Modi and Xi have seen one another in person at multilateral settings. They saw each other most recently at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, in South Africa. But they still disagree on where to draw the line. They still haven't normalized the setup along the border. They haven't withdrawn their forces. And it raises, getting to the broader question that you've raised, it raises the question of, can India manage this? And how does India intend to do so going forward? And the short answer is India has a really difficult military problem on its hands. China has invested in a tremendous amount in upgrading its force posture all along this border, a couple thousand miles. It's very difficult to defend, particularly for India. China has built highways, all kinds of barracks and other military bases, has capable equipment based there, and can move it to the border very rapidly because of this infrastructure development. India has less in the way of capable infrastructure and a harder terrain to traverse, so it's found it harder to get there rapidly. So the capacity of the Chinese to attack at any specific point in this region at any given time is pretty good, and India's ability to defend it at all points, at all times, is questionable. And the most recent event that we saw last winter, Chinese forces basically tried to overtake an Indian base along the border, and they were repelled. And this gets to sort of the future here. They were repelled in part, it appears, because the United States actually shared intelligence with the Indians that the Indians wouldn't have had for themselves. We had surveillance capabilities, Overwatch, that enabled us to see what the Chinese were likely to do. We provided that to the Indians. The Indians effectively used it to force the Chinese back. That was successful. And the likelihood is going forward that we'll do more of the same, because we, the United States, have an interest in making sure the Chinese don't take such aggressive or provocative steps against India along this border. But it's still a really tough military problem for India to face. And it's likely that they can't really do it alone. So it doesn't mean that we'll be drawn into a war between India and China, or that the two are necessarily heading towards war. But this unresolved friction is serious, and it has broader implications, well beyond just sort of the border problem in terms of the bilateral relationship.
Great. So I guess the last question we have for you,
Okay.
it is now 1 o'clock, so I want to try to wrap things up soon. One of our members, Lois Stober, submitted a question. Why does the caste system exist within India's democracy? And I guess this is your opportunity to give us a history lesson. Obviously, we're all familiar with the caste system, and I think the question goes to the point of, here we are in 2023. Why is there still a caste system? Obviously, there's historical precedents for it, but what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the features of India's society has been the caste system. Honestly, we have a tendency to think about this as a sort of an essential feature of Hinduism. To some extent, there's some truth to that, but actually the caste system across India and in parts of what was historically India, that is Pakistan, Bangladesh, the caste system is something that's extended. It's a kind of a set of socioeconomic, divisions within society that have divided different groups from one another. And it's not just among Hindus, it's also among others, Christians, Muslims, and so on. So it's a feature of a historically bound feature of Indian society. It does exist in that people can identify what their castes are, what their family backgrounds are. It is still relevant in terms of often defining the life opportunities available to different Indians in ways that are different, but not entirely different from socioeconomic and other differences within other societies. But these are, have a much deeper historical path to them. But to the extent that it's present, we also have to recognize that modern India has made a number of changes to its society that have created opportunities for groups within what was historically the lower castes, even outcasts, sort of the lowest within that pecking order of Indian caste society, has created opportunities for them that didn't exist historically. And one of the interesting features, actually, of today's India is that India's president woman is from a tribal community, which historically would have been lower caste. And that's remarkable. I mean, to have somebody of that stature. Now, it's primarily a symbolic role, the presidency, as compared to the prime ministership. But it's still remarkable that somebody like that would have risen to such a place in Indian society. And it's a modern development that we never would have seen historically. It's also the case that Prime Minister Modi, a big part of his popularity is that he presents himself as someone who is a man of the people. And that's also because he hails from a lower caste. And so when I talk about Hindu nationalism, one of the really, I think, very important features of Hindu nationalism is that Hindu nationalists are less invested in maintaining or deepening caste differences within Indian society. That is in many ways a very modern movement. It's a modern movement that sort of was given, saw its foundational period in the early 20th, late 19th and early 20th centuries. And in many ways, it's very much just a nationalist movement. And what it aims to do is unify all Hindus regardless of caste. And in order to mobilize, wider swaths of India in that movement, they've made a significant outreach to lower caste Indians. And so, I think that it's important to recognize, yes, again, coming back to the beginning, caste still matters in India. If you're upper caste, there's a good chance you'll have life opportunities not available to others. But it isn't the sole, or even at this point, maybe even the most important defining feature of all of what transpires in Indian politics. And there are really important exceptions to that. And the way that India is developing suggests that caste may become even less important over time. So, I think I say all of this as partly as a corrective, because I think many outside of India perceive that caste really basically defines all of India, and it simply doesn't.
Okay, great. So I guess with that, we will wrap things up. Doctor, I want to thank you for today's presentation. It's been about 4 or 5 years since we did anything on the subcontinent, and obviously a lot has changed since then. You've educated us today about some geopolitical relationships that didn't exist even 4 or 5 years ago. So I think you've opened our eyes to a lot in terms of what's going on. Appreciate you being with us today. We do have a gift for you that I will be mailing to you. So we have a special ceramic plate that's custom made for the World Affairs Council of Berks County that we present to all of our presenters. It has our name on it. It's reflective of our Pennsylvania Dutch tradition here in Berks County. So I will be mailing that to you. Appreciate you being with us today. You're not that far away in Washington, D.C., so maybe sometime in the future, a couple years down the line, we will have the opportunity to actually have you up as a live presenter.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks in advance for the gift. I'll display it proudly at USIP. make sure that it falls under the limits of gifts acceptable by U.S. paid individuals. But no, I really appreciate that and look forward to that. And thanks for the questions and the opportunity to speak with your group. It's been a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you very much. And with that, then we will log off. Have a good day.
You too.